Hi, my name is Kristin and this is Kristin Kraves Books. As you can probably see, I have some of my Halloween decorations on my shelves already. I just couldn't resist doing it early this year. So I thought it was the perfect opportunity to help you build your ultimate fall TBR. I was trying to put together my own TBR and I started to think of different categories that I look for when I want to read in the fall. I do consider myself kind of a seasonal reader, but like it's tenfold in the fall. My seasonal reading really amps up this time of year. I want to read everything creepy, everything cozy fantasy, anything dark academia. Like there's very specific vibes that I look for in the fall. So I had to kind of break it down. And my next video will be me talking about my fall TBR that I put together using all these categories. But I thought first I would break down all these categories that I look for and then give you recommendations if you needed help and just help you to build your ultimate fall TBR. Now this is not a comprehensive list. I will have a million recommendations for each of these categories. There are definitely categories that I missed that maybe I don't personally look for but may be important to you. And if you have any that you would add, I would love to hear about those down below. So obviously the first category that comes to mind for me personally when thinking about fall and the books that I want to read in fall are what witchy books do I have on my TBR that I need to prioritize, because to me, I read witchy books all year round, you know this, but during September, October, part of November, because I do start to get Christmassy then, I want to read all the witchy books that I can. That's really my #1 craving that time of year. So I have 4 books to recommend. I will be doing a separate video with many more witchy recommendations in the future, but I just wanted to give you a taste of that so you can get prepared now. So first we have the most obvious one. I won't talk about this book in my witchy recommendations because I talk about it every single year, but I just have to. It's Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. The entire series is lovely. I actually prefer the books as they go on. Like Practical Magic was the first book that came out. It's my least favorite in the series, but you do have to read it because you have to read this and then watch the movie. It doesn't feel like fall to me until I have watched Practical Magic with Nicole Kidman and Sandra Bullock. That's just like an iconic movie and I love it so much. But so if you want to read the book that inspired that movie, here you go. And it is just, when you think of witches, this is the kind of thing you think of. All these women coming together and making potions. This book is about sisterhood. It's about a family that is cursed so that their first love always ends up dying, and then this gets a little bit creepy. It really does. Even the movie gets a little bit creepy, but it's ultimately cozy, witchy about sisterhood. And then the other books in the series, the first 2 are prequels. The first one talks about where the curse began from. Then we follow the aunts from this book in the second book. And then the final book wraps it all up with all of the characters. But yeah, I can't gush about the series enough. It's my favorite, and if I had to recommend one book for fall, it would be this series. Another favorite of mine that I always find myself recommending because I just love it that much is the Lighthouse Witches by CJ Cook. And you will see another CJ Cook book on cookbook. I don't know why that just tripped me up, but you will see another one on this list because I just love her. Nobody writes atmospheric books like she does. If I want something that I feel fully immersed in, is so atmospheric, I'm gonna lean to one of her books, even though she doesn't have that many. She does have one coming out soon I'm really excited about, but this is her witch book. It is set on a small Scottish island where there happen to be witches that are haunting it because of how they were treated back in the day. So we do get different timelines. We get a grimoire where you see how these witches were treated and why they are haunting the island. We get our main character's childhood where one of her sisters goes missing, and then we are in the present where she gets a call that her sister has been found, but this is many years later and her sister hasn't aged a day. So all those storylines come together. It's so intriguing, so atmospheric. I just love CJ Cook's writing so much, and yeah, one of my goals is to get everyone to read this. It's a perfect fall read. You do have like that isolated island setting, witches, a haunting, kind of maybe a changeling. So yeah, lots to grab onto in this story. I love a good witchy rom-com. I read them all year long. I could do a separate video just recommending those if you wanted to. So picking one was difficult, but I wanted to highlight one because I do think that reading witchy rom-coms in fall is a good idea, especially to break up some of your horror. And I was looking at like 2023 releases for the fall and even early summer. The amount of witchy rom-coms that have come out this year is next level. It is really exciting for me because you know that I love them. But one I wanted to highlight was A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley. I just read this in August. It was ridiculous. It was fun. It was everything you would expect from a witchy rom-com. But the reason that I chose it is because the sequel is coming out, and that is called A Demon's Guide to Wooing a Witch, which I think has the potential to be even better. But what I appreciate about this is you get the witch and you get the demon, so you get both in here. She ends up summoning this demon when she is trying to summon flour for her baking, but she's just not very good at magic, which is a trope that I like. I like a witch who can't control their magic. It always leads to great shenanigans and is a fun time. So you have that in here, and he's like a bargaining kind of demon, so he can't leave until she sells her soul to him. And she's not going to do that. She has no intention of doing that. So they're stuck with each other, and obviously they fall in love. But the romance is not the only plot in this, which I appreciated. There is like a lot of social commentary in here. It's a little heavy-handed and on the nose and all that stuff. Lots of conversations about deforestation and the environment in general, and then also conversations about like finding your voice and sticking up to your parents and to those around you. So yeah, I appreciated some of the themes in here, even though they were kind of heavy-handed and on the nose. But I think that's what you kind of expect for something like this, and I cannot wait to read the sequel. But sadly, I don't think that comes out until the end of November. I wish it came out in October, but yeah, I will be reading that at that time. And then one of my favorite books of the year is Wayward by Amelia Hart. This is more historical, and I do like historical witch stories. I just haven't read enough of them. I have plenty on my TBR. You will hear about that in the future. But this is set in 3 different timelines. We are following 3 generations of witches, and each of these women has been affected by male violence and is dealing with that in different ways. And I think the magic and the witchiness in this is more subtle because none of these women are aware of what they are capable of, and this kind of just comes out of them in times of need, and it's an interesting discovery for them. So we see that evolve as well. And yeah, we see how all 3 timelines are connected. They all take place in the same house called Wayward, and yeah, I thought it was really powerful, really moving, and one I would highly recommend. Moving on to vampires, because I don't think you can have a fall TBR without a good vampire story. If somebody asks me for my favorite vampire book, I always say it's Immortal Rules by Julie Kagawa. Now, to be honest, I haven't read this since 2013, so it has been 10 years, but in some ways it feels like yesterday. This entire series, I remember every character, their relationships with one another. There's a really good character who you think is a villain but is actually kind of just morally gray, and I loved it so much. And it follows, this is YA fantasy, and it follows our main character who is living on the outskirts of this town, and she's just trying to survive, and she really hates vampires until one night she becomes one, and there is a lot of self-loathing there, and she ends up in a romance with a human, and she's trying to hide the fact that she is a vampire at all, but then she gets sucked into this whole world. I thought the writing was beautiful. I really do like what Julie Kagawa does with this story and where it goes ultimately in the end. So if this has been on your radar for a long time, I think now's the time to pick it up. And I do think, to be fair, I haven't read it in 10 years, but from what I remember, I do think it's one of those older YA fantasies that holds up and probably didn't get the attention that it deserved at the time that it was released, and I wish more people would pick it up now. I just love it so much. And I do think that the original covers were kind of cheesy and generic, so maybe people avoided them, but yeah, I just love this series. And then one that I finally read this year that will be in so many lists when you talk about vampires, but you can't not mention it, is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is the gorgeous Fairy Loot edition. This is just as beautiful as everybody says that it is. It is like a Dracula retelling, but my favorite thing is that Dracula is never mentioned by name. The power and voice is given to the women. It is following his first wife, who we see how they met, we see how he turned her into a vampire, and how toxic that relationship turned out to be. And then we see her unraveling and unpacking that and coming to realizations that this is not a healthy relationship. This man is no good. And then maybe having a romance with one of the other wives. And it's just really beautifully done and heartbreaking. One that I think I have to reread and would reread every year if I could. So I could not mention it, even though I'm sure you've probably already heard about it. I just don't think I personally talk about it enough and recommend it enough. So yes, the perfect vampire book for the fall. And the last one I'm going to recommend to you today, because I do have a vampire recommendation video coming up in October, is Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. who I adore. I love everything that she does. I know that a lot of her books are hit or miss for people, and she does a lot of different things within different genres, but they always seem to work for me because I just like her writing. But Certain Dark Things continues to be my favorite from her, and I think it's going to be a hard one to beat. It is on the shorter side, and it is not the kind of vampires that you would normally expect, and it's kind of a more slice of life story as we were following one vampire and a human who are on the run, and it's hard to even say more than that. But there's also like a big giant dog that I loved. But the thing about this one is the amount of lore and world building that Silvia Moreno Garcia put into this makes me crave more from this world. There are different races of vampires, and they don't all get along, and they all have deep history and lore there, and I think there's so much she could do within this world that she created, and I keep hoping that she does. And I know that she has so many stories in her mind, but can we go back to the world in Certain Dark Things, because I think you've set up a lot of wonderful backstory there that I just need to explore more. There's so much she could do there. So yeah, if you're interested in learning about different types of vampires, it's not just your generic vampire that we think of when we think of Twilight or something. Like, she's done some deep world building here, and yeah, it's just brilliant. I loved it so much. Next we have monsters, which I know is a pretty broad category, but if I started to like go into all the different types of monsters, we would be here all day. So I just made it a broad, generic monster category, and I think you could count a lot of things as monsters. Like, yeah, I did vampires, but you could probably consider those monsters as well. But to me, I just love vampires so much, they deserved their own category. That said, there is one that I do own, and then the rest I listen to on audio, but this is one I listened to this summer, This Delicious Death by Kayla Cunningham. Now, this does take place at a music festival, so in some ways it does feel more summery than fall, but I think if you read it in September, it would be a perfect time for it. And it's just the kind of YA horror that I eat up, so I had to highlight it. It follows these girls who are going to this music festival, and you quickly learn that they were infected during a pandemic, and this has made it so that they crave human meat. But the government or scientists have created a synthetic meat that satiates them, so they're all good. But then they go to this music festival, and one of their friends ends up killing a boy there and eating him, obviously, because that's what they do. And there's a mystery that unravels because that is not what is supposed to happen. And yeah, there's also some sapphic romances in here, a lot of conversations about friendship and betrayal and stuff, and it was a page turner. It's a teen horror that is a little bit campy but has some good social commentary as well, and a sweet romance. So I would consider the girls monsters in some way, but there are other monster-like creatures in this story that I don't want to spoil. So yeah, if you're looking for a more campy monster story, this is a good one. Another one that might feel more summery, but I just have to recommend, and I do think you could read this any time of the year and get a lot from it, is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. You might not think of mermaids as monsters, but they certainly are in this story, and there are some jump scares in this book that really got to me, and I feel like that's hard to do in a book. And there's so much tension, you're just waiting for these mermaids to come about. So I know that this book is recommended all the time, and it has been for years. I finally got to it, absolutely was creeped out by it and loved it. And I also highly recommend reading the prequel novella that tells you the story that comes before this book. So Into the Drowning Deep follows a ship of people who are going to investigate what happened to this other ship years ago where all these people disappeared and never came home. So the prequel is following that initial shipwreck or disappearance, and then we slowly learn what really happened here, and the ending is epic and definitely monstrous, and yeah, ate this up. One I just read and haven't talked about on the channel yet is I Feed Her to the Beast, and the Beast is me, and this is by Jameson Shea, and there's going to be a sequel to this, which is interesting because I don't typically think of these horror books having sequels, especially like these YA horrors that I read and love. But the sequel is called Eye in the Dark That Answers When You Call. So let's just be honest, Jameson Shea has the best titles of all time. I'm in love with them. And this first book follows a ballerina, love it, who is in a really prestigious dance academy in Paris, and she is one of the only black students there, and she's often overlooked. She has to work twice as hard, and she really just wants to get what she deserves, and she may or may not make a deal with some kind of monstrous creature and become a monster herself. And though she does terrible things and you don't agree with all or any of her choices, you understand her motivations and you root for her. And it's really a villain origin story at the end of the day, and I can't wait to see more from her. And there is like a little bit of a romance, but it's in the background, so don't go into that expecting to have a big romance. And yes, I just like any book or any kind of media that explores the dark side of the ballet world. The fact that this one actually has like that paranormal monstrous element just makes it even better and unique. And then doing a complete 180, we have a cozier monster romance, which I talk about all the time. Read the whole series this year. Absolutely love it. The first book is That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon. The first book in the Mead Mischief series by Kimberly Lemaine. And this is just a cozy series. With the first book, we follow a character named Cinnamon, who's like a spice farmer. She ends up on this sort of adventure where it is higher stakes than you might think from a cozy, but she ends up in a relationship with a demon. The second book is a werewolf. The third book is a dragon shifter. So we do get all these different types of monstrous characters, and it's just such a gem. We're getting more books in this series, and I just love each and every single one of these, and I highly recommend them. You know I was gonna get through this entire video without talking about cozy fantasy, because that is what I'm craving this year. That is what I'm craving every year, and that's sort of my brand, so I have to recommend some cozy fantasies to you. I think you need cozy fantasies on your TBR, because I've recommended you some vampire books, some witchy books, some scarier books as well. Some haunted house stories are coming and things like that. I feel like you need some lighthearted fun, and I've got you covered. And one that's no surprise, it's been everywhere this year, but I have to mention it, is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I love this book so much, I've read it twice this year, which I don't think I've ever done in the history of my reading life. So that just tells you how much I adored this book. If you've read Memoirs of Lady Trent, it's that but better in my mind. And instead of following dragons, we follow fairies. So we follow a more reclusive main character who works for a university, and she studies fairies. So fairies are very much known in this world, and everybody knows they exist, and there are different species of fairies. So she goes to this small town, this small community, where there's a specific type of fairy that she wants to study, and her whole plan is to not engage with the community, and that does not happen. She definitely gets involved with the community, and then her enemy, who's secretly her friend, we quickly learn, comes to join her, and they have a very slow burn romance, and I absolutely love him. And people say that he's selfish and arrogant, but I didn't get that at all. And I think the vibes of this just are perfect for the fall time. It's the kind of fairy story that I love. There's a little bit of sinister energy from the fairies, which I think feels fallish. So yeah, the sequel comes out in January, so pick this up now. I was gonna do a cozy mystery section, but I realized most of the cozy mysteries that I do read do have fantasy elements. So one that fits into that category is Baking Bad by Kim M. Watt. This is the first book in a series. There are quite a few books in the series that are out. This is a self-published series, and all of the books in the series have punny titles, which you know I am a sucker for that. In my cozy fantasies and in my romances, if there's a punny title, I'm more likely to pick it up. And this is a quintessential cozy mystery. If you've read cozy mysteries, you know kind of the plot beats that they follow. But what makes this one unique is that there are dragons. So in the first book, we are following these women within a women's institute, and a vicar ends up dying. A detective has to come and is very suspicious of everybody. And then there are talking dragons that are very, very worried about this death and about this detective and how she is going to screw everything up for them. So the dragons have personalities, if you like that. If you want your dragons to actually be characters who have thoughts and feelings and are part of the conversation, you have to try this series out. It is a delight. I'm realizing how many cozy fantasy books I have read that have dragons. One that I'm not going to highlight too much on here because I talk about it a lot is Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons. That is super cozy, super slice of life with dragons. But another one that I read for Spiffbo and really, really liked is Scales and Sensibility by Stephanie Burgess, and I also think you should read the sequel. And something about like a Regency romance, that Pride and Prejudice feeling reminds me of fall, and I don't know why that is. Maybe I just rewatch that Pride and Prejudice movie every fall, which isn't very fair because I watch it every winter, every spring, every summer. It's my favorite movie, but this definitely has that vibe. It feels like something Jane Austen would have written if she wanted to make fantasy and added some dragons. So in this book we're following Eleanor, whose parents have died, and her sisters are all sent to different distant relatives, and the place where she gets sent isn't very great. They have a lot of money, but they don't care for her at all, and she has a cousin who is a bit of a brat, and this cousin has a dragon because in this world, in high society, having a dragon like sit on your shoulder and you're almost wearing it like a scarf is a status symbol. But the cousin hates this dragon. She thinks it's disgusting, and our main character forms a bond with her, and then something kind of magical happens that is kind of strange, and I don't even want to tell you, but it's kind of fun. And I loved the romance in here, and the light is changing, but that is okay. We're getting more of a fall vibe now. So the romance in here is really sweet. I loved the second book just as much, maybe even more. We're following her sister Rose, and her sister is in a home that is not as wealthy but is much more warm, and the romance has fake dating, and I just loved it as well. So I think you should read both. And then last for this cozy fantasy section, because I could just go on and on, is another cozy mystery with a fantasy element, and this time it's witches. So another witchy book. This is a bonus witchy book recommendation. This is In a Company of Witches by Orly Wallace, and it's a mass market paperback, so small, but it does follow the same plot points as you would expect in a cozy, but I think that this one's a little bit darker in that we're dealing with a lot of grief. So her husband has passed away, and she's moved back home to this bed and breakfast with her 2 aunts, and she's really going through it. And she can also see a ghost, so you're also getting a ghost element in here. This covers a lot. Then there's a murder, and she finds herself entangled in it because it happened at this bed and breakfast. One of her aunts is a suspect, and she needs to clear her name. So she's dealing with a lot in here, and I just thought it was really wonderful, and I highly recommend if you're looking to get into cozy mysteries but you're more of a fantasy reader, check this one out. Okay, slashers. Now I like a good slasher, I just haven't read as many as I would like, so I need recommendations. Again, sometimes I do these videos for selfish reasons because I want your recommendations in the comments, but I do have 3 that I really liked. The first one is Cloud in the Cornfield. I think when you think of a slasher book that is popular, this is the one that comes to mind. And I think that's for a good reason, because it's fun. It's a good time. There's some social commentary in here as well. I do think it takes a minute to get to the slashing. And to be honest with you, when I read a slasher, I don't want to care about these people. I just want to see what happens, which is probably not good, but that's just the way I am. But once you get to the killings, it is a page turner, and it's just one killing after another, and the author's not afraid to go there. There are clowns in here, obviously, given the title, which is my biggest fear. I hate clowns so much, but I love reading about them in books like this. And yeah, I don't think I'll read the sequel because I haven't heard great things about it, and I don't think it's as slashery as the first one, but if I'm wrong, let me know down below. But if you're looking for a teen slasher, that is a good one. And then one that is decidedly not a teen slasher and is not campy in any way, and I have realized that I like my horrors like this to be more campy, but this one is the exception. This is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, which I think is actually the first slasher I ever read, and it is the book that made me realize I like my horror to have some social commentary once in a while. I thought that this did that very well. I need to continue on with Stephen Graham Jones. This is the only thing I've read by him, I think, but I really loved it, and I still think about it all these years later. And it follows these group of men who did something in their past, and now something is seeking revenge. That is all I will say. You have to experience it for yourself, but if you like a good revenge story, you might like this one. It's not your typical horror. I think you really have to give it the time that it deserves, but trust me, it is worth it. And then one that I'm in the middle of, I might hate this in the end, but I don't think so. It's fun. It's giving me similar feelings to Cloud in the Cornfield because it does have that social commentary, and there's a clown that is killing people, and that is There's No Way I Die First by Lisa Springer. This is a debut. I'm listening to it on audio, and I do think that's helping because I think if I read this physically, I might not like it as much because there's a lot of references to like social media and pop culture and stuff, which can be distracting for me. But in this campy YA slasher, that's what I want. It's a teen slasher movie. I need it to be campy. I need it to be silly. I'm in no way connected to these characters because the author doesn't lay a lot of groundwork for you to do that. So you don't really care when they die, but I don't think you're supposed to. And it's not supposed to make you emotional. That's not the goal of this book. And it's a bunch of rich kids kind of being attacked by this clown. That's what it is. And they're all obsessed with horror in some way. 30% in, I'm into the killings. It's a good time. It's on the shorter side. I'm sure I'll finish it tonight, but I did want to highlight it because I had to film this video before I could finish it, but I did want to bring your attention to that book. Okay, haunted houses, and this is where CJ Cook comes back. This is The Ghost Woods, and it is arguably my favorite haunted house story. Now, the haunted house in this book is more of a house that takes in unwed mothers, like pregnant unwed mothers. It's not like an official house for that, but that's what they do here. And we are following 2 timelines that are told only 5 years apart, but it is in like the 1950s, 1960s. So we get some of the social things that were happening at that time. And one of the characters here is discovering that the house where she is not as kind as she first thought, and maybe there is something creepy and haunting. Maybe there are ghosts happening here. If you like spores, like mushroom kind of horror, like Mexican Gothic, there's a touch of that in here, as you might be able to tell from these mushrooms on the cover. But really, ultimately, this is a book about motherhood and what it means to be a mother. So if that's not something you're interested in, maybe don't pick this up. But if you just like spore, you like deeply atmospheric reads, and you are somebody who likes conversations about motherhood and creepy haunted houses, this is a good one to pick up. But I do recommend trying the Lighthouse Witches first, because I think that's an easier one to digest, even though The Ghost Woods is my favorite by her so far. I gotta talk about What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I couldn't get through this entire video with talking about T. Kingfisher. This entire video could have just been here, different T. Kingfisher recommendations, because you could do an entire T. Kingfisher TBR for fall and you'd be in heaven. It'd be fantastic. But this was the first horror of hers I read, and what a place to start. This, if you liked a lot of the themes in Mexican Gothic, I think you will like this one, but it might be a better one to start with even because it's on the shorter side. It is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher, which, side note, I just watched a trailer for that. There's an adaptation coming to Netflix, I think in October, so I'll be curious to see how that one goes. It does look like a more modern take. This version of that story does hit a lot of the plot points that are important in the original story by Edgar Allan Poe, but it does something more interesting, adds some uniqueness to it, makes it its own story, which I think T. Kingfisher is really good at when she does retellings, because she does a lot of them, but she always kind of revamps them and brings them new life and really makes them her own, and that is certainly the case in What Moves the Dead. But I'm sure you've heard about that a lot. I just had to endorse it again. And then one that hasn't even come out yet, it comes out on October 3rd, but I had an ALC from NetGalley, is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, who I'd never read from before. This is my first Alex E. Harrow, and I've been told that all of her books are very different. Like, people have different favorites, some they like, some they don't like. So I'm curious what your favorite from her is if you've read from her. But this is her haunted house story. It is adult. It is following a main character named Opal, who is raising her younger brother and just wants to get him out of this small town and give him a better life. So she has been drawn to the Starling House, and there is one caretaker left of the Starling House, and I think his name's Arthur Starling. And so through generations, his family has taken care of this home, and she's called to it. Like, in her dreams, she just can't avoid this house, and she ends up being a housekeeper there for him, making money to help her brother go off to college. And they have maybe a romance brewing there. There's definitely feelings between her and Arthur. I think that's his name. What if I'm telling you his wrong name? Let me look this up. Yeah, it is Arthur. I knew that was right. Anyways, they have like a bond that forms, even though he's trying to keep her away from this house. He's got his reasons. The house in this is haunted. It is creepy, but I kind of liked it. It was like, you kind of felt for this house, and the house is certainly a character. I love when the house is sentient, kind of has feelings, is making decisions, and is manipulating characters in certain ways. You do get that. This is a small town. There's some great side characters as well. Opal thinks that she's so alone in the world, but there are people that care about her, and they are important to the story. We learn about her history with her mother who has passed away, all this stuff. There's a lot of layers. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic, and it does make me curious to read more from Alex E. Harrow, so let me know what your favorite is down below. Then I have to talk about House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. This is a YA book. It is a retelling of 12 Dancing Princesses, and it is way creepier and more haunting than you could ever imagine, than you might expect from a book like this. It takes place on an isolated mountain in this house where we are following these sisters. There were 12 of them, but a lot of them have died over time. And you start to get attached to these sisters and invest in their stories. You're sad about what happens to them. There are ghosts in here. There's actually a really nice romance that I liked, but most of all, it's about sisterhood. But it's so atmospheric, so creepy, and one that I hope to reread because it is up for the Book Checkout Book Club. And last I checked, it was winning among all the polls, but who knows, Gideon or Goblin Empire might overshadow that one in the end, but we will see. But yeah, it's one I want to reread because I just read the sequel, which I also want to recommend, House of Roots and Ruin. It is not as creepy as book one. I would say it's a haunted house book, but not to the level that the first book was. But the first book, that is what it is. This one follows the character from book one, and I think even telling you who the character is might spoil the first book for you, even though I do think you could read them independently. They do kind of act like standalones because book two is taking place 20 years later. but the last 50% of this book was wild. I had whiplash, the twists and turns. It is disturbing. This book is way more disturbing than book 1, but not as haunted as creepy. But it all does take place in a sort of haunted house, or a house where things are not quite right. I'm just going to leave you with that. I'll talk about this one more in my wrap up, but it's hard to talk about because I want you to read book 1, and I just don't want to spoil anything for you. Something I discovered this year is that my favorite genre of horror is sci-fi. I love a good sci-fi horror, but I haven't found as many as I would like. So again, selfishly, give me your recommendations down below. But my go-to author for the subgenre has been Mira Grant, and I feel like I'm getting through her backlist, at least her novellas. I love a horror novella. So one I'm going to talk about is Square Cubed, which is the last book of hers that I read. I could recommend Final Girls. I've already recommended Into the Drowning Deep and the prequel and stuff, but Square Cubed I just want to highlight because I don't talk about it enough. It is a novella. Again, it's a book about sisterhood, and it talks a lot about physics, but I don't think you have to get hung up on the physics of it all because I know nothing about physics and I was fine. I just went with it. It's more about these two sisters who were separated during a rift, and one is still on Earth and the other is on the other side, and the sister who's still on Earth is desperately trying to find a way to reconnect with her sister. That's all I'll say. It's brilliant. And then one that is not sci-fi horror, sci-fi thriller, but I had to mention it, Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. If this has been one that's been lingering on your TBR, I think fall's a good time to do it. You might fall in love with Blake Crouch and want to read his entire backlist this fall. I wouldn't blame you. So there are a lot of themes in here normally I wouldn't like, a lot of tropes and stuff, but it worked for me. I think that Blake Crouch does a really good job of making sci-fi thrillers accessible. If you are somebody who doesn't think you're a sci-fi reader, but you are a thriller reader, I still recommend this one. I think it has the potential to still work for you and maybe open your eyes to a new subgenre, or at least a new author who does this so well, because I think it's hard to find somebody that you can compare Blake Crouch to. So yeah, I'm sure you know what this is about, but it follows Jason, who is abducted one day, and he wakes up and realizes that his wife doesn't know who he is, his son is not his son, he doesn't have the same career path, and he's just reflecting on his life, the choices he made, and he's desperately trying to get back to his old self. So it's like parallel lives and stuff like that. Thought it was really well done. I couldn't help you put together the ultimate fall TBR without talking about dark academia. Now I know I'm missing some other categories. I would love to hear about your suggestions down below or what you would add to this TBR, but the first book I have to recommend for dark academia is one of my favorite books of all time, and actually two of the books I'm going to talk about in this category are my favorites, so probably both in my top 10. So obviously I love this subgenre. But Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth, it's a bigger book, I realize, but I listened to it on audio the first time I read it, and I had to buy it, and there's some great illustrations throughout here as well, so it's like a really immersive reading experience. It does that thing that a lot of books like this do, like Broken Girls by Simone St. James. That's another sneaky little recommendation there that I think is dark academia and is similar to this. But it is set in two timelines, one in the past and one in the present, and it is set at an all-girls boarding school where some things go down. People die, it's haunted, it's creepy, you'll never look at wasps the same way again. And then in the present timeline, we're following a group of women who are actually actresses, and they're filming a movie about what happened in this place all those years ago, and maybe things start happening again. I absolutely thought this was brilliant. I thought this was genius. I love it, and it's my favorite dark academia book. It's my second favorite dark academia book. I will show you my favorite one at the end because I feel like maybe some people wouldn't call my favorite dark academia, but I could see an argument for why it is. But anyways, yes, read this book. I won't talk about this one for too long because I do feel like it's like a classic at this point within the genre, but If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. If you like Shakespeare, you have to read this. It opens with a scene where our main character is in conversation with a police detective who is responsible for putting him in prison, and he is about to be released, and the detective comes to him and says, I just have to know before I retire what really happened all those years ago. And then they go back and tell the story of how this person was killed and our main character's involvement in it. It takes place at a university, follows very pretentious characters, as a lot of these dark academia books do, and I love that. I don't love pretentious characters, but in dark academia I kind of expect it, so I look for it and I love it. And in this one you get that because they are all huge Shakespeare nerds and talking Shakespearean quotes and stuff, and it's a lot, but I loved it. And the ending was absolutely shocking to me. I think about this ending all of the time. It's one I really need to reread at some point. I almost put this as its own category, but if you're a fan of like those good for her kind of thrillers, but you also like dark academia, highly recommend They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. It is my favorite of that very niche subgenre. It follows a woman who's a university professor, and she just kills despicable men who harm women and do terrible things. And eventually people are starting to notice that the bodies are piling up on this campus, and she finds herself intertwined in the investigation. That's it. There's more that happens there, but that's the base. That's all you need to know. Pick it up. And then to wrap this whole thing up, this has been long, but I just love talking about fallish books. I just love it, and putting some books maybe on your radar, or just encouraging you to pick up books you've probably heard about all the time, but just have never taken the chance to actually read. And I think my favorite book probably fits into that category if you haven't picked it up already, but this is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, my favorite book. I love this book. And it's one of those books, if you haven't been spoiled for, because I wasn't when I read it, it will shock you. I was so surprised by where this went. But at the beginning, we were following these children who are all friends at this boarding school, but they don't seem to have parents, and there's something off about the boarding school, and our main character's kind of noticing it, and things are slowly revealed. And you see the impact that that school had on these characters, and really it follows three characters who have interesting relationships with one another, and you see how they move apart and come back together throughout the years and their roles and stuff. It's so interesting. It's on the shorter side, but it's my favorite book of all time. And I do think at least the first bit of it does fit into that dark academia kind of vibe. So that's all I'm going to say about this one. It can fit into other categories I've mentioned, but I'm not going to say anything more than that. You just have to read it. So there we have it. We're done. I hope that I could put something on your TBR today. I'd love to hear if you're a seasonal reader, what categories you would have added to these, and new recommendations you have for any of these subcategories. Because after I post this video, I'm going to put together my own TBR based on these categories, which I'm really, really looking forward to. And yeah, I'm just ready for fall, obviously. So I hope you are too, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks for the support. Bye for now.